Hi, I'm Miranda Mulligan. I'm the Executive Director here at Northwestern University Night Lab. And I've been working in and around newsrooms for about 15 years. And I generally will describe myself first as a designer, second as a journalist, and third as a digital strategist. There's a significant difference between the way that we practice journalism in digital, in particular on the internet or the World Wide Web, because that is the way that people communicate with each other on the internet is more around communities. And so we can't be in a position in which we just talk at our audience, talk at our readers. If it's through TV, if it's through radio, if it's in print, then we're talking at them. They're not having a conversation with us. We're not having a constant and continuous feedback loop. Well, this model breaks down when we try to practice journalism on the internet because people expect to be able to communicate back and forth with us. And so one of journalism's futures is going to be very much focused around developing communities around different beats or different types of stories that we cover when we are practicing journalism. Of course, print is going to have a future. And TV will still have a future, and radio will still have a future, and how we and the internet will. It's just how those mix together, and how we structure our business in order, and our revenue models, and how set our expectations against that. How we will continue to make money off of print will change. How we make and evolve, and the way that we are currently making money and earning revenue from the internet, that's going to change and evolve. All of these are going to continue to change and evolve until eventually it just kind of settles itself out. Right now, it's uncomfortable because we're in the middle of not really knowing how the business models are going to work themselves out. When you think about the differences between digital media versus print media, you have different costs. It is not cheaper, it's different. There is a perception that it is cheaper, and that comes from kind of the 90s and maybe the early 2000s in the way that we were understanding the internet. As we kind of evolve and grow our craft and the way that media functions on the web, it's very quickly that breaks down. While we don't have to pay for print, we do have to pay for people who manage our websites, that manage our technology, that manage our communities. The engagement editors at media companies, the people who directly talk and communicate with readers that want to give us feedback on our stories, are absolutely essential roles, because that is the way that right now, the way humans use the web. And so we need to have engagement editors working directly with them. But that does not mean that digital is cheaper, and it should be cheaper. That is kind of an old way of thinking. I think when people are talking about journalists needing to be thinking more like entrepreneurs, there's 2 points that are actually being made there. One is that typically storytellers were not expected to pay any attention to business side. We thought, okay, well, I get hired to go and tell stories, and if somebody tells me more how we make money off of this, it's going to jeopardize my credibility as a storyteller. I will no longer be have this very clear autonomous line from and I might be influenced in the type of journalism and the type of stories that I might tell if I get more involved in the business side of things. And that's quite naive, and it falls apart now in modern day. It's in our best interests as storytellers to understand how our business works and how it is supported. Not that it should necessarily influence the types of stories or the types of things that we cover and the types of things that we are reporting and researching. But it is irresponsible for us to not understand how that works. So the other half of when people are encouraging journalists to be thinking more like entrepreneurs and starting their own companies and taking more ownership over their publications is because it's very easy to do that now. It's not hard to just start your own publication, and it's not hard to be able to publish to web. First things first, when you're telling a story that is data-driven, it's always going to be bespoke. So it's always any story that you're telling, just like any narrative you might craft, any story you might tell with data is going to be designed for the data. The second thing is you're going to look for a story. What is the point? You don't want to just make a quick data dump or a quick chart or a very quick long table, and that's not data journalism. That's just kind of throwing or vomiting data at people, and nobody likes that. So what you want to do is you want to find a way to show what is happening in the data so that a reader can quickly understand it, as well as give them an opportunity to explore if they want to, if they're interested and intrigued. You want to make it easier for them to explore and go as they want to through something. So generally, that's what you're going after when you're trying to tell stories through data visualizations. And other ways that you might want to think about it, there's multiple forms and multiple kinds of ways of visualizing data, and so you should always pick a way of visualizing what's going on in the data that helps a reader understand the story that's going on in the data. And so I can't really say use this here, use this always when you have that, because it's always going to be about showing what's going on in the data set. There are a variety of different resources and tools that are kind of becoming, and companies that are coming up around this. I like to think about those as more of a tool that helps me practice journalism, a tool that helps me know what's going on in the story. So it's not really a tool necessarily, these automatically generated paragraphs from a data set is fine when you just have a series of small briefs. I've got a bunch of numbers and I can tell a computer to write a paragraph out of a bunch of numbers. And that's not intended to remove the human out of the process, but in a sense take away some of the tedious work that we do. There's also some interesting work happening with using devices and drones to capture stories. A friend of mine, Matt Waite, has the Drone Journalism Lab, in which he's got these kind of robot airplanes and small cars that have cameras attached to them, and he can use a remote and fly the plane over an area and like capture video in a way that it would be very difficult for a human to go and do that, but he can send a robot to go do that, or on a car or something like that. And there's been some interesting experiments with that around National Geographic. That they've gone and captured wildlife behavior using these kind of remote-driven cars and remote-driven small flying airplanes or drones. And then there's been some interesting sensor data projects that have been happening. So WNYC, John Keefe's team there did a project last year in which he worked with the community to install these sensors in the ground to understand when the cicadas were going to swarm out of the ground. And they gathered all this temperature data, because as soon as the ground temperature reached a certain warmth, that is when the cicadas were expected to come out of their slumber. As far as questions around people saying that the idea of interactive games and how spending some time thinking about and analyzing interactive games and how that might improve the storytelling that we practice when we publish stories to the web. And that's something that I've thought about for years, and I really love the idea of looking at the way that people play games, in particular narrative games, and understanding more about the behavior that happens there. When somebody's playing a game, they're very engaged, they're deeply immersed, they're paying 100% attention, and it's because you're involving them. They're not sitting back and just letting you talk at them. You're drawing them in. And there's been plenty of research and data behind whether or not if you involve somebody in a story, if you involve somebody in teaching them something, they remember more, they retain more information. And so there's a lot of thinking that we can be doing around finding ways to involve our readers a little bit more so that they understand more about what stories we're trying to kind of cover and report on. We can also learn a lot from how people play games in particular, and how people play games on their phones. More and more we have people using small devices to be able to read our stories. And these smaller devices, and mean that people can not only manage their bank accounts, but they can also make phone calls, they can communicate with people, and they can read publications, and they can play games, and they can live their entire lives through this. And this is a cheaper way to have what used to be multiple devices, and now I can just have one device to be able to do all of those things. The implications for that means that smaller communities, people that have less money, are more likely to have just a smartphone, not to have a desktop computer as well as a tablet as well as a phone. They would have just one device to be able to connect with us. And so what we can learn a little bit more from like how people play games and how game designers design games, we can understand a little bit more about how people use these devices so that we can get smarter about how we do engagement efforts and how we do designer interfaces and how we allow people to use gestures to navigate through their phone. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot, it's a kind of a more theoretical way of thinking about design, but there's a lot of really interesting things there, primarily from the concept of if we involve our readers, they will understand more about what we're trying to tell them.